Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Thursday, March 28th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about the Donald Trump claim that the 2020 and now 2024 election will be rigged. This strategy that Donald Trump is employing here might end up backfiring on the GOP nominee as it puts Republican turnout at risk, especially in the early days of early voting leading into the presidential election. Now, Donald Trump has been making very prominent claims that the 2020 election was stolen. Everybody knows that he is a firm believer that he won the last election and that Joe Biden is an illegitimate president. But since then, people have started to come to realize that this is not something that they are necessarily aligned with. The overwhelming majority of voters, roughly 67% of voters, believe the election was not rigged in 2020, and just roughly 75% of Republicans believe the claims here, with nearly 1 in 4 Republicans saying that Joe Biden legitimately won the election. And while those numbers actually might be too high for some people's liking, I think it might be surprising that a significant number of Republicans are buying into that. For almost everything else that Donald Trump does sort of tout as his 2024 platform and as something that he really associates heavy with his campaign, he often finds that roughly 45% of this nation is aligned with him. And that's not the case on issues like election, in his eyes, election integrity, or in believing the 2020 election was rigged, or in some other issues like abortion across the U.S., where you do start to see roughly 2/3 of this country aligned in one vision for what they believe on certain topics. And so while this video could really go down multiple pathways, I think one of them that I really explored was the possibility that this type of rhetoric would be damaging for the 2024 election. I've sort of shied away from it a little bit more in recognizing that if all of this rhetoric mattered as much as it did, it would only really impact the Republican Party. I think many people have written off Donald Trump believing the 2020 election was rigged by saying, maybe he believes that, maybe he sees some discrepancies in the voting, but at the end of the day, Joe Biden is president, and this really doesn't matter. And I think a lot of this, too, about claiming the 2024 election will be rigged only has electoral impact on Republicans and doesn't really sway, obviously, any independents or Democrats in favor of the Trump column, but I don't think it necessarily deters them entirely either. I think Democrats were already going to vote for President Biden, and independents who were upset with the 2020 election lies will probably be upset about the 2024 ones, but there isn't going to be that many people who are okay with it in 2020 but are not okay with it with 2024, and so it's really just a balance here. But I think on the Republican side, though, as the Wall Street Journal predicts here, it says that it is putting Republican turnout at risk, and this is genuinely where I think you are going to see the most, detrimental impact of Donald Trump's strategy here in calling the 2024 election rigged. Now, I want to first say, looking back at the past few election cycles, we have seen direct down, pitfalls for the Republican Party in leaning into this idea that elections, if they don't win them, are stolen. Looking back at the 2022 midterms in the governor elections here, I remember a very big part of the reason why Kari Lake now was propped up by Democrats and has largely been seen as the one Republican the Democrats could easily defeat is because after she lost the governorship to Katie Hobbs, it ended up with her going on months on end about how the election was stolen in Arizona, how she was the rightful governor, and how this election in its entirety was a sham. She also went so far as to insinuate that other states were undergoing this, electoral fraud. Pennsylvania, right? Michigan, Wisconsin, states that even Donald Trump doesn't believe genuinely went to their opponents, right? And so the Republican Party, for a while, really tried to push away from it, but it was these types of nominees that perpetuated this same exact idea. The same exact idea that if it isn't my way, it's stolen. It's rigged. And voters were very clearly upset with that. I mean, even prior to the governor election, Kari Lake being a 2020 election denier was a large reason as to why she lost the governorship in the state of Arizona. Katie Hobbs by no means ran a phenomenal campaign, and I think while she did have a strong enough one, she certainly could have done better. And I think a lot of people in hindsight reflect on that campaign and recognize that there certainly were areas of improvement, right? But I think where you do start to see a stellar Democratic campaign compiled with a poor Republican candidate, someone who really is not strong, somebody who has taken on positions and associated themselves with January 6th. They're associated themselves with 2020 election fraud. You find yourselves in states like Michigan and Pennsylvania. Doug Mastriano, who attended the January 6th insurrection in Michigan. Gretchen Whitmer running against Tudor Dixon, who was vehemently pro-life and unapologetically believed that the 2020 election was stolen. What happened here? Democrats ended up winning in Michigan by 11, won Pennsylvania by 15. These are both states that Donald Trump had won in the 2016 presidential election. And so to see these states so overwhelmingly blue, there has to be a reason for that. And that's because voters were very much turned off by this, claims that the election was rigged. But I will say, a big part of it, too, wasn't just that, voters on the independent side and the Democratic side, as I was talking about again, if they're unhappy with Trump from 2020 and those election fraud claims, they're not going to be happy with the ones in 2024, but not that many people are really going to change their minds over it. What I do think, though, is that it does inspire a base, and it does decrease, the inspiration amongst the Republican base when they see claims such as this one. I think we have seen this, too, in electoral history, not just in 2022. I think another example would also be on our Senate races in the same exact year, in the midterm year, where we saw a state like Nevada, where a lot of the early vote and a lot of the mail-in votes here seemed to be indicating that Democrats were going to do quite well. And then on Election Day in 2022, snowstorm, road closures, right? Issues with getting out to vote, decreased enthusiasm for wanting to get out of your house and turn out and vote. And what happened here was that Republicans were building up this narrative, right? Building up this idea, leaning into the Donald Trump rhetoric, the rhetoric that he was still continuing to spread on Truth Social or wherever it might be, through surrogates, through Fox News, whatever it was. The Donald Trump effect, whether also sometimes it wasn't even him who was doing it, but rather Republican operatives on his behalf, who may not have been acting at the direction of Donald Trump, but were saying if the 2020 election was stolen, the 2022 election was probably stolen as well. And so it makes voters not trust early voting. They don't trust mail-in voting. And so when they only have the opportunity to vote on Election Day to ensure that their vote is secure, they end up not turning out if the circumstances of the day are not correct. It wasn't just there, though. It wasn't just the state of Nevada. The most recent one happened in the New York 3rd Congressional District, where we saw an equal number of early and mail-in votes from the 2022 midterm elections to the 2024 special election. But Election Day was cut in half from what it was back in 2022. And so you saw that Democrats had built up seemingly an insurmountable lead. But it really did come down to who was turning out on Election Day. Well, if you remember, what did happen on Election Day is that there was a snowstorm yet again. It's an issue that Republicans realize maybe this isn't the right strategy for victory. And the New York special election proved exactly that. Roughly 80,000 voters voted in person ahead of Election Day. You saw here that there were 66,800 voters who turned out during the 9 days of early voting in which Democrats, as they note, unsurprisingly, had an advantage. More Democrats turned out, Republicans were decreased here, and, you found that these 80,000 votes built up the bank for Democrats in the New York special election. Another number, they note, 4 to 10 inches, a snowstorm hitting the area. A forecast there expecting, and did in fact, dampen turnout. Schools in the district were closed. Travel conditions were not good. The Republicans were spending money to get, roads paved and cleared in Republican precincts. Republicans did everything they could because they knew it relied on a high turnout Election Day. And that simply didn't happen. Combination of factors, I'm sure. I think Tom Suozzi would have won regardless of the weather. But it never helps when your entire reliance on an election victory comes down to one singular day, where there are factors entirely out of your control that can make all the difference. And so New York is an example. Nevada is an example. But the alarm bells, are coming through a variety of different ways. Because while snow and weather are one end of it, and one thing to recognize might be a problem in 2024, this general rhetoric is overall dangerous to the Republican electorate. Because what they see here is looking at the 2021 runoff elections in the state of Georgia. A lot of voters out there were wondering, how does this happen? A lot of Republicans on the mainstream media were wondering, how did the Democrats in fact expand on their margins? And I think a lot of them wrote it off as saying, voters were upset with President Trump, which was true. His approval rating was rapidly decreasing and voters were not happy or at all enthusiastic about the 2020 election fraud claims. But leading into the election, he had maintained these claims. He had said that this election is going to be stolen, but let's wait and see until what ends up happening. And then afterwards, he said, it's absolutely stolen. He called out Brian Kemp on Twitter. He called out Brad Raffensperger at the White House, right? He did all of these things to go out and say that Georgia, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania were stolen, were rigged, were taken from my column and given to Joe Biden at 2 a.m, in a curve that's not possible in nature. He made all of these, very, very outlandish claims. And while voters, may not have positively responded to that, it wasn't too far off from the Donald Trump prior to the 2020 election. And while I do think there were some voters out there that decided that they weren't going to vote for him this time, the shift in favor of the Democratic Party actually largely came from decreased turnout amongst Republicans. Many Republicans you can see in focus groups, news interviews, article after article, and in actual turnout on Election Day that many of them decided that they were not going to vote. Their reason being, they might have been more upset with Donald Trump, but for many of them, it was actually the reason that they thought the 2020 election was rigged and that there would be no point in voting in the 2021 runoff. And so when Donald Trump made these outlandish claims, you can see here that voter drop-off in the Senate runoff elections happened in the more conservative parts of the state. For instance, right up here in Georgia's 14th district, right around the region of Marjorie Taylor Greene, Trump wins these counties with 80% of the vote across almost all of them. That's where you saw some of the least amount of turnout, and you saw decreases in turnout from 19 to 24%. The parts of the state that you saw the least amount of decreased turnout, the Atlanta metro area, right around this region here, where you found that Democrats were running up the margins in Fulton County, 73 to 26, DeKalb County, 83 to 16, Clayton County, 85 to 14. These parts of the state, Gwinnett too, 58 to 40. And looking at the shift from 2016, this entire region was the driving factor in making Georgia a blue state in 2020. And so now looking that Donald Trump is claiming the 2024 election is rigged, he's trying to adopt this idea here. Too big to rig. The idea is that if too many Trump supporters turn out, the election is too large of a victory that they can't change it last minute. Now, on one end, I think that this is, in Donald Trump's eyes, in any capacity, recognizing that his victory in his eyes was not large enough to overcome. But on the other end of things, too, I look at it and say, you know what? This is not the way that you win over the voters in your electorate who believe the election was rigged. This is not the way you go to voters and say, this is an election where if you just vote a little bit harder, the Democrats can't take it from you like they did last time. I think many Republicans are jaded about elections. I think many of them believe genuinely that these elections are rigged. You can see comments about it all across the mainstream press, to voters, to, journalists being said and spread as rhetoric saying, what's the point in voting if it's just going to be given to Joe Biden anyway? What's the point in voting if Democrats are just going to call in these ballots from China, right? All of these random conspiracy theories that popped up during the 2020 campaign that have withstood the test of time, that have now permeated into the 2024 election season and now directly uplifted by the GOP nominee for president, all of these things could genuinely decrease Republican turnout and have an adverse reaction on Donald Trump in inspiring Democrats to turn out against him. I think that these claims are very, very outlandish, and I think they're also just generally dangerous to the democratic process. He is priming his voters for an eventual election victory, and that's the only way you can see this to be true. Calling the 2024 election rigged preemptively the same way he did back in 2020 was a way to tell these voters ahead of time, I'm going to lose, but it's not going to be because I lost the election. It was all of this, this internal strategy the Trump campaign and the Trump White House tried to employ to maintain his legitimacy, to maintain his standing of the party. You didn't see Mitt Romney in 2016 running for president saying, give me another shot at this because it was stolen from me. You didn't see John McCain run in 2012 after losing in 2008. You get one time to go at the presidency, and if you win, that's good. You win re-election, that's good. If you lose, you stop. That's how these things work. But I think genuinely, Donald Trump and I think Democrats might roll their eyes at this. Republicans might be giddy at this. But I think by making claims of the 2024 election being rigged, he sets himself up well, forget this, 2028. I know that might seem outlandish, and I know that might seem too far to perceive into reality. But one thing we could have predicted, and I think very, very accurately, that if Trump lost the 2020 election, he was back in 2024. And while he may be older, and he may have less energy, and his party might be tired, with somebody who was in the Republican primary, when they had plenty of other more electable options, was getting 60 to 70% of the vote, I don't know if the party will be tired of him after this. And while Republican turnout might decrease, and this might be, Donald Trump, digging a hole, digging his own grave, right, for his campaign, for his strategy here. He also might be trying to legitimize himself for the next election and trying in a way to cover all his bases. So we will see what happens here. I think Georgia should serve as a very, very consistent reminder. New York should serve as a reminder. Nevada should serve as a reminder. Elections should serve as a reminder. Even the 2021 for mail-in ballots and early voting, in this idea that those are safe and good practices for voting on the Democratic side, benefits them and serves to the detriment of the Republican Party and their electoral chances in elections coming up, and in this specific election where Donald Trump might see a direct negative impact of the language that he is using in context of the 2024 election. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.